In 1963, as these protests had now been going on for 7 or 8 years, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a group headed up by Martin Luther King, took its protest to Birmingham, Alabama. Essentially what they wanted was the stores in Birmingham to be desegregated, both in terms of customers, yes, you can shop here, and working, yes, you can work here. Strictly segregated city in Alabama. And one of the strategies was to do, again, perfectly legal things that it's not legal for you to do. Go stand in the store, go stand on the street outside the store and don't move. Sit-ins and marches and walk-ins happened, and the strategy was to call attention to the protest, and they called attention, and many of the protesters were arrested, of which Martin Luther King was one of those. He wrote a very famous document called the Letter from the Birmingham Jail while he was incarcerated. And he said that the protesters aren't the problem. What they're protesting against, that's the problem. And so many of the protesters were jailed that the strategy of the protest movement was, well, let's take our children, maybe your age, high school age, young men and women, but even younger, middle school, maybe intermediate school, maybe not even little kids, but medium-sized kids, could go out and also stand and protest. Well, what happened is that to quell the protests, the safety forces in Birmingham used first police dogs. You can see what the police dogs are doing. They're attacking the protesters. And secondly, high-powered fire hoses. And with a high-powered fire hose, you could push someone from one goalpost to the other on a football field by the force of the water. Notice all these images. Police dogs, fire hoses. This was the era of everyone had a television, and although everyone had a television, much like they do now, everyone watched the television because they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have iPads, they didn't have tablets, and they didn't have any other media other than the 3 networks that offered programming. And each of these networks had news shows, and each of these network news shows had extensive film of African Americans being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs. And in doing that, and when you get to the scroll through these notes yourself, if you click on this link, you can see some footage rather than just the stills that I have here. And the governor of Georgia said, I'm in favor of, I draw the line. We're going to stay segregated. We're going to be segregated now. We're going to be segregated tomorrow. We're going to be segregated here forever. And all this played out on the evening news as people were sitting down at 6 p.m. to see what happened in the world today. They see American citizens being attacked by German Shepherds. But at this point, the president, who's John F. Kennedy, is outraged this is going on. He had walked a fine line. He supported civil rights, but he was not an activist in any way. But after he sees this, he goes on national television and says, this is not acceptable. This is something that was fixed 100 years ago. And 100 years have passed since Lincoln freed slaves, yet the great-grandchildren of the slaves aren't truly free yet. Things are going to change. And he proposed a extensive, comprehensive civil rights law. All well and good. There was a march on Washington, much like the one that had been planned right before World War II. It was really the centerpiece of this campaign in which Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Again, you can listen to that once you get these notes yourself, if you so desire. There's a link right there. And that's also was very dramatic and very good, but the legislation itself got stalled in Congress. There was, again, lots of backlash against it. And then came John F. Kennedy going to Dallas in 1963 and being assassinated. And his successor was Lyndon Johnson, a Texan, a southern state, an ex-Confederate state, but he was in favor of civil rights, and he used, in part, Kennedy's assassination to say there's no better thing that we can do for John F. Kennedy than to honor him by the passage of this civil rights law. And he pushed hard for it. He pushed hard for it, and he pushed hard for it. And 6 months later, it passed Congress, and he signed it into law. This is important, and you should know this too, because many, many things, including equal pay for equal work, which is still a reality in this country, but is the law, women and girls sports, equality of education, all come out of the Civil Rights Act. Not explicitly. It doesn't say anything about having a girls' basketball team at Cardinal High School if you have a boys' basketball team. But the reality is the reason you have boys and girls sports in high schools in America today is the spelling out of the idea of equal protection of the law in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Very important. You should also know that the last bulwark of the double standard was voting, and immediately after the Civil Rights Act was passed, African Americans began to start to register to vote, met again with opposition, met again with violence. I'll let you scroll through and see this again. Very, very famous footage of violence in Selma, Alabama, and elsewhere in Alabama. And again, the second march, also bloody, bloody Sunday, bloody, very many deaths. And once again, the President of the United States becomes outraged that this is playing itself out in our country, demands a law be passed, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. Now, we've kind of run through this, but what this does is this creates a turning point in the civil rights movement. De jure, that by law, by legislation, segregation, double standards, voting exclusion, all those things are now illegal. They're now illegal. They've been ruled illegal. There's new legislation that spells out what civil rights will be and what voting rights will be. The problem is the law has been changed. Does that mean that everybody's hearts and minds have been changed? And okay, now that this is the law, we will all join hands and we'll be okay. And you see the political cartoon there. You see that there is the Jim Crow segregated schools, but there is the, in this case, New York schools that because of housing, the way people live, their schools are all segregated too. Are these two types of segregated schools joined at the hip? Are they the same? Are they twins? Or are they vastly different? How do you desegregate schools that aren't officially segregated, but in fact, de facto are? So civil rights movement moved north. Again, not going to spend a lot of time on that. You can scroll through it. You should, because there'll be questions. And like I said, it's open note. You can look them up. Please look them up on my notes, which I'm giving to you in this order for this reason, rather than try to Google everything like you sometimes do and come up with some sort of cockamamie answer that doesn't really go with the questions. Led to a lot of violence in northern streets, and it led to a lot of newer wave African American protesters who thought that civil disobedience, just sitting there quietly while you get arrested or get attacked by a fire hose or a German Shepherd, wasn't the way to handle yourself. What you should do is go demand. Don't ask for rights, go demand them. The Kerner Commission was put together by the President Johnson, and they said that, racism and discrimination, we've been talking about those southern states and the ex-Confederate states, but there's the same kind of prejudice in the North. And secondly, that the real problem in the North wasn't the law, it was just poverty. And poverty was a lack of opportunity. That meant that they had to do a bunch of other empowering things in the African American community as one of the new wave of protesters. A guy by the name of Stokely Carmichael said, it isn't black or white. The real key color is green. Economic power leads to political equality. And there were a lot of northern African Americans who had a harder edge, let's say, than Martin Luther King. Not that Martin Luther King was soft, he just took a more peaceful method to obtain his goals. But a harder edge, Black Panther Party, Malcolm X, you'll see about both of them. But the reason this segment ends in 1968 is another turning point. Like I said, the conflicts and the protests had changed over the years. Not so much in the South and not so much about segregation laws, but all over the country and having to do with segregation practices, de facto things that had to be changed, possibly not even by the law, but by people changing. Martin Luther King was the symbol of and still professed and still practiced nonviolent civil disobedience, peaceful protest. As he said, our weapon must be love. So he went to Memphis in 1968 to join a poor people's campaign. It was the garbage collectors of Memphis. And he made a speech one night, and there was going to be something else, and there was going to be something else. And he went back to his motel, and he went out on the platform outside his room, a terrace, whatever you call those things, balcony. And from the next building, a guy with a rifle shot him and killed him. Almost looks like a staged photo. It isn't. It's the seconds after. Fire the gun, shot rings out, King falls over dead, and the guys all, because they can see and hear, point directly to where it's coming from. James Earl Ray, arrested, convicted, went to prison, stayed in prison, lived out the rest of his life in prison. And the motel, very symbolically, is now a civil rights museum. It's like an era ended with the death of Martin Luther King. There wasn't that larger-than-life figure to be the umbrella person of the whole movement, and the most determined, peaceful protester has been removed. Now, there's other protests, there's other leaders, there's other eloquent people, but there is no unifying person like Martin Luther King had been. The civil rights movement doesn't stall, but with many of the laws changed, we're worried more now about how people act and react than what's actually on the law books. And that's it. All right. What you will do, hopefully, is look through these notes. You will go to, you have already looked at the crash courses, 1950s, 1960s, and you'll go to Edulastic, and you can use these notes to answer those questions. And that is the last of your assignments for this weird virus